This week we are considering the controversy over Confederate memorials. It's interesting to put them in the context of Civil War memorials and monuments more generally. Understanding the nature of monuments from the last presentation about monuments and memorials, we know that we want to look at the nature of the memorial structure, its form, its materials, and of course the symbolism portrayed in statuary or other architectural ideas. Let's start with Confederate memorials themselves. Although some memorial and funerary structures were erected shortly after the Civil War to mourn the fallen, the vast majority of Confederate monuments and memorials were constructed at a later date, in the late 19th and early 20th century, during what's known as the nadir of race relations. During this time, we see a codification of the lost cause ideology of the Confederacy, a celebration of that time as a lost golden age of Southern heritage. During this time, the United Daughters of the Confederacy sponsored a plethora of Confederate memorials, erected throughout cities and small towns across the South. Many of these were actually mass-produced structures that could have been ordered by a community with little customization, and as a result, we'll see that a lot of them have a very similar appearance, as well as a similar placement in their communities. Let's take a closer look. This is the Georgia Monument at Chickamauga Battlefield. And here we see a celebration of Confederate Memorial Decoration Day in 2007. So it's important to remember that some of these memorials have also been traditionally not only just a static symbol, but also a site for ritual activities and commemorations. Taking a look at this, we see, first of all, there's the size of this thing. It's huge. And then also there's the soldier standing at the top holding the flag, standing in a heroic position. Less heroic and less grandiose, but also similar, are the portrayals of most Confederate memorials around the South of the standing soldier. So here we have standing soldier statues in Moultrie, Georgia, Tyler, Texas, Millen, Georgia, Covington, Georgia, Americus, Georgia, and one in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And as you can see, they're all very, very similar, very typical. The standing soldier, sometimes holding a rifle, sometimes not. And in some cases, these statues are almost identical. The soldiers are mounted on a large granite pedestal. And if you look at the background of these images, you can also see that most of them were also erected very pointedly in similar places, town squares, or in front of courthouses. Another common set of symbols we can see in these two monuments, one from St. Louis, Missouri on the left, and one in the bottom right in Baltimore, Maryland. We see the heroic figure of the soldier leaving his family, which also in many ways glorifies the women behind the soldiers, the daughters of the Confederacy, and a Columbia or Liberty-like figure at the top of the Maryland monument, crowning the Confederate soldier with laurels. A similar figure also appears in the Confederate monument in Arlington National Cemetery. And we also see the families behind the soldiers, and strangely in this one, also an African-American woman bidding a soldier goodbye, which may be some kind of reference to Black Confederates. Here in New Orleans, we have the second most common image that we see in Civil War monuments, and that is of the seated general on his horse. This monument has, I believe, this is of Beauregard, and it's subsequently been removed, as has this one. A lot of these monuments contain not only funerary or heroic imagery, but they also have very specific kinds of language engraved upon them. Here in an obelisk monument in New Orleans, we see a very specific point of view articulated in this text, which reads, United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election, November 1876, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. Now, this language is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it's celebrating the end of Reconstruction after the 1876 election, and it's also very explicit about the celebration of white supremacy. Many of these statues either implicitly or explicitly do this. They do so in using language that glorifies the cause of the Confederacy politically or militarily, but then also makes oblique references to race or to a kind of natural order. In other words, these statues are not just about fallen soldiers, but very much about the moment in which they were constructed, reinstating white supremacy in the wake of both the end of Reconstruction, as well as the rise of Black civil rights organizations such as the NAACP. And their creation is coincident with the height of racialized violence in lynching, as well as the proliferation of race riots in the early 20th century. The Confederate memorial in the square at Decatur, Georgia, which was recently removed and which we'll see later in this slideshow, was actually constructed a year or two after the 1906 race riots in Atlanta, as was the statue of John Gordon Brown outside the Georgia Capitol. Perhaps the most grand and glorious collection of monuments is in the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, and specifically the Robert E. Lee Monument, which has become recently infamous. For the longest time, these monuments were considered largely untouchable, and this is actually the Jefferson Davis Gate, which has also recently been vandalized with anti-racist graffiti. Monument Avenue is lined with the statues of Civil War generals Robert E. Lee, but also Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart. The Stuart Monument was recently removed in July of 2020. And here we see the removal of these two statues, as well as Stonewall Jackson. The Lee statue is slated for removal, but tied up in court battles, but has also become the site of major public art and political expression in support of Black Lives Matter. So the initials B, L, and M projected onto the statue itself of Lee, but the pedestal in particular has become very dynamic, sprayed with anti-racist graffiti, several layers, but also now projections of African American figures, Frederick Douglass, John Lewis, Harriet Tubman, and George Floyd, whose death at the hands of police prompted the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Closer to home, we have the recently removed Confederate monument in Decatur, Georgia. Again, this monument's very typical. It's an obelisk on a granite plinth, mounted in front of the county courthouse, with language celebrating the virtues of the Confederacy. This became the site of controversy in the last 2 years as local groups called for its removal. Again, because this is technically against state law, the first impulse was to contextualize with signage, which indicated that this monument was specifically tied to the ideology of the Lost Cause, and that it had been erected 2 years after the Atlanta race riots. Last year, the monument became the site of protests for its removal and also calls for Black Lives Matter. The monument was eventually removed in June of 2020, both the obelisk and the plinth, right after midnight on that date. And now we have just the bare space there, and there's currently an effort ongoing in Decatur to decide what is going to take the place of this monument. Apropos of your upcoming assignment, think about, if we remove the symbols of the past, what do we put there instead? If we look around Atlanta, we can see plenty of other examples, not only in street names, which are changing, but prominently the John Brown Gordon statue outside the Georgia Capitol, which again during recent Black Lives Matter protests was protected by the National Guard by order of the governor of Georgia. Other important Confederate monuments and memorials include the Peace Monument in Oakland Cemetery, which has been covered several times by red paint and anti-racist Black Lives Matter slogans. And also the monument in Piedmont Park has also been covered in red paint. Here we see the Peace Monument being cleaned and also its original painting. Now, these monuments are currently protected by state law, and there are calls for their removal as well as the calls for them to remain. One response that has been done is to contextualize them as the Decatur Monument was contextualized. And recently, the Atlanta History Center, as Dr. Lee discussed in her presentation to you the other week, were actively involved in recontextualizing these statues when they cannot be removed. In the case of both Oakland Cemetery and Piedmont Park, the center helped create signage that put the statues in the context of the lost cause and the institutionalization of Jim Crow, as opposed to letting them stand as more seemingly neutral memorials to fallen soldiers. What to do with Confederate memorials is an ongoing consideration here in Georgia, and perhaps the most unwieldy is the largest one, the Stone Mountain Memorial, the Confederate monument at Stone Mountain Park, which was first proposed in 1915 with the creation of the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial Association, an organization that had strong ties both to the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the KKK. The memorial was not completed until the 1970s and is of course protected by state law, as well as the practical impossibility of its removal. Debate has been ongoing about what to do about this monument, including stopping the maintenance of the structure and allowing nature to overtake the images. Or perhaps, more tongue-in-cheek, adding additional imagery to broaden its context. We've taken a look at Confederate monuments specifically, but there are also other memorials and monuments across the country commemorating the Civil War. Let's see what they look like compared to the Confederate memorials. In terms of imagery, there's quite a lot of similarity, and also additional symbolism that gets added. This is a Civil War monument outside the U.S. Capitol depicting the pain and glory of battle in the upper right-hand corner, and we also have numerous generals seated on their horses, as well as overt classical Republican imagery, as we do here on this statue honoring Meade outside the Capitol. More seated generals on their horses at Gettysburg. The one on the left, Virginia State to the Virginia State Regiment, and on the right to General Meade. At Gettysburg, of course, while we have monuments there to specific generals or battalions, there's no overt language of the Confederacy per se, with the emphasis being on the heroism and loss of the soldiers. Standing soldiers again, in this case Union soldiers, as in this Woonsocket Civil War monument in Connecticut, but also sentimental Victorian representations, such as the one on the right, the soldier returning to his beloved family, also at the end of the war, also in Connecticut. And also there are several important monuments to the colored troops who fought during the Civil War. On the left, there's the monument to black soldiers in the U Street neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and on the right, Shaw's Memorial in Boston, which pays tribute to the famous Massachusetts 54th Regiment depicted in the movie Glory. It's interesting also to contrast images of soldiers and generals with those of emancipation. There's a very interesting book by Kirk Savage called Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves that discusses this contrast. There are actually very few monuments or memorials to emancipation in the United States. The most famous is the one here on the right, the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C. The statue was funded and erected by African American groups in 1876 and depicts Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation next to a Masonic pedestal engraved with Washington's likeness. No irony here, blessing this kneeling slave whose chains have been broken. The imagery of the kneeling slave came straight out of the abolition movement and the logo of the National Abolition Societies, and is reproduced here in the context of emancipation. It's also present in the statue to the memory of Scottish American soldiers in Edinburgh on the left. There are also other monuments to emancipation with a growing emphasis on Black history It's interesting to put the kneeling slave in the context of other more recent memorials, such as the Freedmen's Memorial in Dallas, Texas, erected in 1990. Adorning the gateway, we see two noble African figures, the male a warrior, the female named Griot. We go through the gate and we see a woman kneeling alongside a formerly enslaved man. These sculptures and the larger monument are the work of African American artist David Newton. Sculptures have a sense of dignity. We don't see the grateful kneeling slave here, but also a sense of grief and trauma survived. It's no accident that this memorial is erected on the site of a former freedmen's cemetery, which was extant until the 1930s, when it was largely wiped out by road construction. In more recent years, we also see the much more active portrayal of freed people, again, less grief-stricken and less passive, but active and strong, as in this Emancipation Proclamation and Freedom Monument for Browns Island, Virginia, where we see the formerly enslaved woman, a mother holding the Emancipation Proclamation, and a man with his chains broken standing in a powerful stance. A similar feeling is felt at the Texas African American History Memorial in Austin. The memorial depicts a larger history of African Americans in that state, but its centerpiece is focused on the Emancipation Proclamation, embodied by powerful and joyful freed people, one of them holding up the decree. It's interesting to contrast these American statues of emancipation, particularly the kneeling slave, with other emancipation statues in the Americas, specifically the Caribbean. Here we have the Busa Emancipation Statue in Barbados, a large, massive statue of an enslaved man who has broken his chains. In Port-au-Prince, Haiti, we have La Marron Inconnue, the unknown slave. Marron, also related to the term maroon in English, a word that names the formerly enslaved who escaped and formed their own free colonies. Here the unknown slave blows the conch horn to call other enslaved people to revolution. And finally, I wanted to insert one last example. This is from 2019, the African American artist Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, which was erected first in New York City and will now have a permanent place on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Wiley's image of a contemporary hoodie-clad black man with dreadlocks on a horse mimics the stance of Jeb Stuart on the recently removed monument in Richmond, embodying a new battle for Black lives.